Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 42. My guest in this episode is Dr. Helen Pankowsky. And Helen is a psychiatrist who has been using cutting-edge modalities, integrating traditional medicine with holistic and alternative methods to work with her patients. And I've known Helen personally, and I consider her a friend, so I'm very happy to have her on this interview series. And in the interview, we discuss her book called Living Aware and Inspired. I'll have information for that down in the description field of the video. And our conversation springs from that book, as well as a bunch of other things. And we talk about a whole bunch of stuff. Probably too much to try to put into the introduction. So I thank you so much for being here. And by being here, you're supporting the channel. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. This project is just a hobby for me. I don't draw any revenue from it. So I thank you very much. Your support means a lot. And thank you for enjoying this conversation with Dr. Pankowsky and myself. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Helen Pankowsky to the IdeaCast interview series. And Dr. Helen and I have been working for a little while to get together and be an audience with each other. And so it happened. And I would like to welcome the YouTube audience and thank you for your time and thank you for being present with us and a passive observer of what I'm sure will be a very interesting conversation. So Dr. Pankowsky, welcome and thank you so much for being on my little interview series. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much. I know you've interviewed some stellar people, and so I'm quite honored to be here. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Well, you're part of that cohort, so I without hesitation, and of course, this is again something we've been planning for some time. So, you know, prior to any perhaps stellar people coming on, we were talking. So yeah, I'd like to go ahead and we'll look back a little bit and see learn a little bit about you and where you're coming from. You're a therapist. You're a medical doctor in psychiatry. And so if you could just give us maybe your history in that regard, and you're also a published author, and so we could talk about maybe what led you up to the creation of your first published book. So I hand it to you.
Thank you, Justin. Well, my story is a bit odd. A lot of people in my field kind of know they want to be a doctor from the time they're very young. I knew I did not want to be a doctor from the time I was very young. I was mostly an artist. There's my inspiration board behind me, so I still do a lot of work. And so when I look back, I see that I've been following something that I write about in the book, which is soul curriculum. It's like a trajectory. And so that even though, you know, as a child, as an adolescent, I was more of an artist and kind of, I don't want to say flighty, but creative, we'll say. Mm-hmm. So when I went to the university, I had in mind to study art and psychology because I thought that I might be useful in art therapy. I just thought that might be fun. Okay. But in my school, they didn't offer that. And so I was sort of going to create it as I went along. Ended up very entrenched in art and thought I would be a commercial artist, a graphic artist. And then at some point, and this is where, you know, I almost want to call it that mystery guidance, because at some point I thought, you know, I've done art since I can remember, but I may not always have a chance to study what a university offers. And so I decided to not go into art as a profession and just to focus on psychology. And I took psychology and sociology as a double major. And the best I can describe what happened next is I was just about finished. I was ready to I had all, you know, the requirements and everything. And I almost want to say I literally woke up one morning, or I was walking along. I don't remember exactly how it came to me. I said, I've got to go to medical school. It was the weirdest feeling. And yet it was absolutely correct. I knew it. Now, you have to understand that I had never taken a science course. I'd never
Mm.
even thought of studying science.
Mm-hmm.
And here I was making this decision, and I began on a year and a half of fulfilling the medical school prerequisites,
Okay.
which was the craziest thing I think I've ever done because I was pitifully unprepared for medical school when I did get in.
Oh boy. I can believe that. You're taking a 90-degree turn there.
It was completely, yes. And in fact, people around me could not believe it.
Mm.
You know, my mother cried.
Oh no. Yeah.
I
What are
mean,
you
people
doing?
thought, exactly. I'm not the scientist. Are you crazy? But I loved it. And as I
Mm.
studied physics and calculus and biochemistry, it's like I could feel my brain opening to a different perspective of the world.
Okay.
And I think that that has been a very big part of all of this is allowing the integration of the scientist, the intuitive, the creative, the intellectual. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I was well integrated. I went through a long period of time where I felt I could be one, but not the other. I couldn't be both. And over a series of beautifully, divinely orchestrated, what we might call coincidences or synchronicities, which I can or don't have to go into, but I began that integration so that I could exist as both an intuitive and a scientist. And then at this point in time, I can clearly say, I do believe the reason my path was so windy,
Mm-hmm.
in part was to give me this broad perspective, personally, to allow those connections in my brain to be made so that I could really open up to perceiving the world, people, humanity, our purpose in life in as broad a perspective as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that for me, the reason all of that happened is because by having an MD behind my name over 30 years ago, I was able to do things that would not have had the credibility otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
For example, in my book, I talk about the kinesiology to unblock unconscious beliefs and systems that I used for a very long time. And I actually learned that from a medium and attended a workshop, and it was mind-blowing to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw the changes within me. I've always been able to be an observer of my own process. So I saw those changes. And enough to where I started teaching it and, for her. And then over time, she and I talked, and she wanted me to take the information, rework it in a way that would be palatable for like a medical community,
Okay.
and just make it my own. And so I did that. And I was able to teach it to nurses and, at the medical school. And so it gave me a credibility
Mm-hmm.
that I wouldn't have otherwise. And it was because medical school was not easy for me. You can imagine. I mean, I was not
Yeah.
prepared.
Sure,
And I
sure.
had a love-hate relationship the entire time with medicine
I can imagine, yeah.
until I found my niche, which is what I do now. And it is the integration of traditional psychiatric modalities. I do use medications when needed
Mm-hmm.
with the higher consciousness, the energy healing, so I often say I have my prescription pad for my medicines, but I have a separate pad where I give people their prescription for their meditations and what to watch on YouTube and what books to read.
Right, right.
So I've been very, I think, fortunate or grateful that I could carve this niche in a way that may have been helpful and contributed my little piece of contribution to this work, which is so, I mean, I'm delighted to see it so, quote, mainstream now. Because when I started, I was often the only MD at the energy conferences. So that's my story.
And an intriguing story for sure, because I think it takes some moxie to take two systems that seem at least 30 odd years ago at odds with each other, maybe, or irreconcilable in some regard, and mostly asymmetrically on the science side, that and it's true to this day, and for good reason in some regard, and also too stodgy and too dogmatic in other matters, I suppose. And so you're bringing that integration in, I think, is good, because you do have sort of the governing means within you to not only make it a coherent presentation of what's being transacted in the, say, alternative means and modalities, but also having the sense to know either the language or the presentation that it would be palatable on the science side, or the more intellectually rigorous side, or however you want to call that. So I think that's important work. And we see it a lot now. I suppose it's becoming more acceptable.
Much more, which is good, because that is what I saw when I began the process, when my colleagues, and this is a direct quote, were saying, I think Helen's gone off the deep end. However, what I discovered, and this was the brilliant part of it, because I've always felt that if there's a truth, that truth has to be correct for everybody. And it has to endure. And what I found was, when I finally broke through all my obstacles to being open about this, and I would talk about it freely at lunch with my colleagues, and most people were very open. They knew they were intuitive. They knew they had had mystical experiences. This is universal. And I found that in my practice, whether I worked with, the CEO of a company, or, and I was amazed, because here in Texas, I deal with Texans a lot. At least I did then. Now it's more international, but
right.
And the kind of redneck Texas oil man who I would never have expected comes back to me and says, "You know how you taught me to manage my anxiety? Well, I was in my truck the other day, and I was just oming all the way." So what I have discovered is that is probably closer to the truth, that we are these divine humans, and we do have that capacity. We're just not tapping into it. We're not acknowledging it. And, in my book, I begin with intuition for that very reason. It's the most accessible thing for all of us. We are all intuitive. But most of us, and myself included in the past, and even now, because we're human, will ignore it, deny it. And so I set out to figure out, how can we all learn to trust it better? Are there some tricks? Is there something we can do? And so that's why I began my book with intuition.
Yeah, and you do a great job covering the matter of intuition and functionality and things like that. And you know, it saying intuition, it's almost an ambiguous. So I guess a definition of intuition. And in fact, I follow philosophers on Twitter, and a couple of them were batting that about the other day. And is it, you know, partly 1/3 belief based? Is it 1/3 functionality? You know, abstraction that we can't really define what the provenance of intuition is. And I would agree that, you know, if we were to box intuition into a definition, it's just very, very amorphic and very tough to grasp, right? The idea of intuition. I mean, we could try to look at it analytically, but I think intuition is more kind of like trying to define religion or anything else. It's like, you know, there's perspectives and there's aspects and so forth. So having just said that, what would you present as if you were talking to someone who had no idea of intuition or even felt intuition? How would you present that to them that would strike that intuitive tone with them, that they would be able to suss it out and say, oh, okay, I get that?
Well, I go into that. Yes. I think first and foremost, to begin, you're absolutely right. It is amorphous and it's hard to define. So what I've been most interested in is like more either hard or empirical evidence, like how do we know?
Okay.
And I think we know when we can observe ourselves. And that's why it's about aware. I mean, living aware, being self-aware, so that we begin to recognize when we have that sense of knowingness. I just knew I should have blank. And then it proves to be true. And it's in that proof that I invite people to pay attention. So because intuitive information will come in non-judgmentally. It'll come in without outcome, it's an impartial feeling, but it will feel correct. So that's sort of a very general way of saying it. Now, I tried to figure out, okay, is there an area in the brain? And there was some stuff periodically about how it might be in the temporal lobe. But honestly, a lot of this is a mystery. We just don't know.
Yeah.
And all I can say is that feeling I had to go to medical school felt absolutely correct, even though it was completely out of my range of experience. The last thing I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And yet it felt correct. And so we all have that kind of guidance. And whether we call it intuition or psychic or, gut feeling, and probably if we were to examine some of the most creative people out there, but in any field, we would find that they are guided by that inner voice, that knowingness, that something that comes in that is a clear understanding. Now, with my broader sense than I had at the point that I wrote the book, I can say, we're tapping into the quantum field, and in the quantum field, there's all the information, and we're getting that in. So maybe that's it.
Yeah, there could be that, or one way I would, for my own life, try to reconcile some of the functionality that's going on there is to think of almost in a quantum sense, but realizing that if you looked at computational or statistical probabilities for not something discrete like a wave collapse, but discrete for everything that your history has brought to this frame of the present moment, that that coupled with the crude intentionality, so the not the aboutness, but more just the your intentions for the future. I think if you are a conscious being, and it is not some happenstance of physics, that you are a conscious being, and there is consciousness as a functional biomechanism, or whatever you want to, interactive, whatever you want to call it, whatever consciousness is that there is permeability in a sense. So there may be a lure to the future. So, and without going on too much of a tangent, there's something called process relational metaphysics, and they talk about that. There's this sort of Platonic forms behind you and collapsed realities behind you in history, and there is you in this frame of the present, and then there is a kind of a lure, and they call it the eros, or the attraction to the future, and that's where it gets kind of spiritual, mystical, but it is that this draw to the future. And I think if we silence ourselves, some parts of ourselves, to have access perhaps to that lure that is in front of us, not us, may nothing, not be anything external. It may just be all of reality flowing in one direction. Stuart Kaufman talks about that, I think, in a way that, it's just this complexity emerging kind of idea. But anyway, I'm tangent here.
I love the way your mind works, Justin. I'm so much simpler, because I keep it simple for me. I feel like we are souls who come into this life for a reason. I mean, very, very early on, I got to thinking about it, and I was looking at nature, and I said, everything recycles, everything comes back, everything, it doesn't make sense that this thing that we call a person would just live this life and be gone. That didn't fit.
Yeah.
And so at a very young age, I didn't know what it was, but I finally began to understand that perhaps we do come back at some core essence of ourselves, and that we are always in a process of evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think of it as the soul's curriculum. And so I simplify all of what you said by saying, we tap into our soul's curriculum and we begin to follow it. And then we know we're on the path, because everything will feel right, even if it's hard. I tell you, I went from being one of the top students in college to being one of the lowest students in medical school.
Sure.
It was a very humbling experience. And yet I never wavered. Even in retrospect, I'm like, it was really crazy. I mean, nuts.
Sure. And I guess I should walk back a little bit and simplify all that babble that I was just talking about, because it's more, it can be very simple. It is, there are probabilities of the future. And quantum physics talks about this collapsing and blah, 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 and decoherence, but this is more just a subtler probability based on history, also based on intention. So the combination of those things in a conscious sort of biopsychism or conscious process, whatever's going on, that again, we don't know it necessarily, but future potentials we may already know without knowing, like you knew without knowing that you would arrive at a place that is better suited than if you had become an art therapist, or if you had become an artist, and not that there's anything wrong with those potential histories, but the potential history that you chose has brought you to where you are. And yes, and so I'll simplify back to you with the idea of like the soul's journey, or the soul's path, or even karma. And so one model that I work with, because I'm kind of agnostic about what the ultimate nature of reality would be, but it's that, we talk about the unitary oneness of consciousness, of the universality of consciousness, that the soul is our metaphor for that which is expressing through us. And so we are indeed individual perceptually in this lifetime, but that our ensoulment is that, as some people would say, the spark of the divine, or as I would say, maybe the localization of a universality of consciousness expressing itself. You're expressing a very individual life. I'm expressing a very individual life. Lots of novel experience, lots of suffering and joy and all these things going on. So that, to me, that kind of represents ensoulment and a path and lessons to be learned, but maybe very spontaneously and very without order, I guess, but not nihilistically chaotic, if that makes sense. And so I say that conditionally because, like, just like religion has the problem of evil, and theodicy in Christianity, where they have to reconcile, why would God let a child get engulfed in flames and burned to death, and or run over by a tractor, something hideous, and that's my theodic out, or theodicy out for whatever that might be, to allow for us to suffer and allow for us to make terrible mistakes or make really great decisions, that kind of thing. Anyway, I'm tangenting again. That's just kind of how I would look at the soul's journey, is that it's very spontaneous. And going back to those process metaphysics people, one thing that they Whitehead quotes, and that is that God suffers with us in this expression, in this unfolding of the next moment to create history. And I like that. Because we could drive ourselves nuts wondering, like, why are children dying, or anybody, women, children, men, doesn't matter, young, small animals, why is there so much suffering? And I think suffering is an investment.
Right. Or the Holocaust.
Oh my God. Yeah.
I grew up as a child of a Holocaust survivor.
Yeah, absolutely. And why did we go through that? And why would so what would 30 people can die in terrible, terrible conditions, and that should be enough for whatever is going on in the great database up there. But to have 6 million people perish needlessly, or probably, well, there were 30 million people lost in the war, and a lot of them were lost in that regard, and just any kind of thing like that. Yeah, just why, And so that's where I like Whitehead, who's the process guy. He says God suffers with us. So I like to think of spontaneity in that as well, rather than sort of a plan necessarily. And I'll get your input on that. But for me, a plan involves people being taken to the gas chambers and taken to gulags and Pol Pot and his bad behavior and all those things. And so yeah, how would you reckon with suffering and intentional cruelty and so forth in relationship to our learning our lessons and our learning how to be human and how to navigate experience?
And that's the hardest part of this way of thinking, that somehow our soul has chosen that path. And so I like the idea of God suffers with us. And I do think there is some degree of individual choice, because ultimately the choice is what is either leading us to evolve or to stay stagnant or to devolve.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the first part of my response. The second part, Justin, is, and this is what I encounter in my own thought processes when I try to, I think of it as following the thread. Where does the thread go? And that is how I came to do this work, because when I did just medications, I thought, this isn't quite working. There's something not quite right. When I was doing Jungian style therapy, it's the same thing.
Okay.
And I would hit and I did a lot of different modalities, the kinesiology, EMDR. I did a lot of different things. And I would hit what I would call the wall. It was like the limit of what that thing could be. And so I've always thought, if I hit the wall, this goes back to the whole idea of, if there's a truth, then there must be some other way of looking at this. Okay. And so I feel like in my own thought process, I've evolved, with the work of Valerie Hunt and Joe Dispenza particularly. But there's like this point that, to me, I can only call it the mystery. I don't know. We don't know. How does a person who can conceive of evil not see what they're doing? I don't understand. And so, and how can we have a wide range of definition of evil? How is that possible? That is something else I don't understand. And so ultimately, when I reach that state, it's kind of like, if you've ever imagined going out into the universe, and you keep going and you keep going and past that and past that and past that. And how really, I mean, where does that, and ultimately there, you don't know. There is no answer.
Yeah.
And so then I have to bring it back. And when I bring it back, I asked, okay, so what is next? And the next for me is the idea that, number one, we acknowledge and live in such a way that we are embodying our divine, well, let me start with the human, our human nature. Our human nature is vulnerable, fragile, tender. The body's going to get sick. Our hearts are going to get broken. We're going to, be in the shower sobbing. I mean, that is our human nature. We're going to enjoy, a good glass of wine. We're going to have fun at a theater. I mean, in other words, that is the human nature.
Yeah.
But at the exact same time, we have the divine within us. And that transcends all of that. That transcends the body, that transcends the external, that also empowers us. And I've come to see that the most terrifying thing that we can do as if you want to say incarnate beings is to embody, to actually take in that empowerment. And the reason for that terror is because it holds huge responsibility to be divinely empowered. And this is what I've seen in people over and over again. It appears at different levels. But it is one of the reasons that so many of us may pay lip service to the idea that we're divine, but to really embody it is a whole nother story. Yeah. So that's kind of, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of my response to.
No, that was a good, clear answer, because and I'll steel man a little bit back to you and say that so the divinity within us would be the beingness without so much of the primateness or so much of the baggage of our history with us. And I've been coming to maybe holding a postulate lately that, maybe our higher intelligence, that we sort of evolve these cortical brains, is sort of on the cusp of maladaptive, proadaptive, right? So it's kind of, we're at a crossroads, and to call ourselves Homo sapiens might have been an early, almost arrogant, hubris-oriented call.
We're good at that.
We're quasi sapiens, right? We're not quite the wise ape just yet, And it's like, I think we're at that flashpoint in our let's just say 150, 200,000 year history, where we did have, pretty good control of this part of our brain to be smart and calculating and go beyond just surviving in the environment and being instinctual. We're self-reflective, we're metacognitive, we have feelings, we connect with other creatures socially, much more than just pheromones and things like that. And so to think of all of that is the capacity to transcend and to be in, again, that realm of divinity. And so then I would define divinity as acting on a nature beyond instinctual behavior, petty, combative, survival-oriented behavior. We've got very powerful brains, but we're still in that sort of. I mean, our next closest relative is the chimpanzee, and we can look at chimpanzees when they go to war with each other. It's very much the same as what we do, and so I'd see that as a point where we have to be a little sober about our. And we're doing, we've done it throughout our history, is be very combative, very. And then of course we have to reconcile with tribalism. There's so many complexities in it, but I think if we can transcend all of that, all of the baggage of our evolution that hasn't quite been reconciled, I think that's a move into where our psyche, our expression would be much more benevolent, much more altruistic. And there's a debate about altruism versus selfishness now. And it's like, are you kidding me? This is how we became who we are, is through sharing and cooperative behavior and maybe giving a little without expect. So anyway, that's how I would see divinity evolving in us, is to recognize our nature in a sense that's malleable. It's not concrete. We are not just necessarily born to club people to death if we don't agree with them or they have our food or whatever. I mean, I think that's where I think we are. I think we're in that crossroads where the potential for, again, divinity, and I don't even know how I would define divinity. I think it's just a greater expression of perhaps the mystery, and the mystery being in us, indwelling, and we see that glimpses of that, I think, periodically, right? When we are sacrificial, and we are the agape love, the love of giving and the love of
unconditional,
sacrifice.
absolutely, unconditional love, the hardest thing to do.
Yeah, the Christ narrative is a perfect example of that. We have a story, a figure, an archetype who came to sacrifice themselves. If you follow along with that narrative, that's part of the agape too, and it's sort of a very narrow focus. It's controversial in a sense that, how do you interpret that sacrifice? But just somebody he's a good example, or even Gandhi, and Martin Luther King giving up their lives. Not that Martin Luther King volunteered to give up his life, but he knew there was a price on his head for what he did.
Well, actually, all our great teachers,
yeah, exactly,
have I believe they have all been there as models of what we can be. And so I realized there was a second part to how I wanted to respond to you about when we go way out there and hit the mystery, and then we have to kind of come back down into our little bitty bodies.
Yeah.
And you've touched on that, because at some point, I think it's okay to stop trying to figure out what the mystery is.
Mm-hmm.
And then the purpose is, it doesn't matter, because how do we live in the best way possible as, let's call it, divine humans?
Yeah.
And that is what you're talking about. Well, I talk about self-awareness and about being inspired in your life, not just because I want every individual to be that, to be wise and thoughtful and kind and loving, but because by one individual doing that, they affect everybody in their circle.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen this over and over again. There's nothing more satisfying when, after a generation or multiple generations of abuse, or just simply living in such a closed-minded way, the next person opens up, the one that I have the honor of working with, and their children begin to do things differently. Mm-hmm. And now we've really begun that ripple effect. And at that point, let's say it doesn't even matter what all of this philosophical is. Isn't life just better when we're at peace, when we're comfortable with each other, when we trust each other, when we're loving with each other, when we're kind, when we're compassionate?
Yeah.
And to me, that's kind of it. Let's do that. Yeah. We can do that.
Mm-hmm. And I think for me, you just define divinity in a sense that setting things aside and setting, so we could be conflict oriented, we could be solution oriented, and to be solution oriented brings a set of tools with it. Whereas you have the same, different tools, but you can do things in conflict oriented behavior. And yes, to keep that space open for those around you that can be impressed by you, to live that model of, you can't put a value on it. So in other words, not to say good humanness or right humanness, it's more just to live where your affect is positive, where the valence is positive, where the outcome is positive, has an impact on others that's positive. So yes, I think that for me would be a great working definition for the divinity within us, is to be,
And
despite your history, despite your surroundings, you are there as a representation of what that transcendence from suffering, misery, anger, whatever, all those things.
or the recognition that we're going to suffer. And, this is, sometimes I say I have an argument with Buddha, maybe I don't understand it well enough, but I feel that emotions have to be dealt with. They do. It's part of being aware. But then once we deal with them, once we know them, what do we do next? And that's when we have to go to these places that we're talking about. And that, to me, a while ago, I talked about empowerment and how we're so afraid of that. But that is empowerment. It's not, walking around like I'm the big boss.
Yeah.
It's that knowing, and you can be very humble and empowered. You can be very, you said a little while ago about Soul's curriculum that I don't know exactly how you put it, but it doesn't matter what we do. It can be the gardener, it can be the person who chooses to stay at home. It can be anybody. It is how we are all living in that life.
Yes. And the choices we make spontaneously. And I'm not necessarily so bringing up that sticky wicket of will and free will and so forth. I'm sort of about, who cares, right? I like to talk about, like, we have choice. So we may not too. We may not ultimately
think we have free will, which is why we get into trouble.
Well, I think we have will to a degree. So I could get absurd and say, I can't levitate. I can't walk through a wall. So my will is limited to an extent. I don't go as far as people in physics who say everything's determined. From the Big Bang forward, everything's on a causal chain. I don't buy that, because we are conscious creatures. But I also don't go 100% into what they call libertarian free will, in that every choice is ours. Because if we talk about ensoulment, if we talk about paths or plans, that perhaps it is not our will. Perhaps it is a co-will or a cooperative will. If we were to, again, put a Bayesian X up here and say this factor that we don't know about influences the outcome of behavior, et cetera, I would say that the will is a shared will, perhaps, and maybe that's a compromise, because God knows that's a rabbit hole from hell, is to talk about will versus no will, blah, 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 blah. But I like the idea that we do, and also, as you said, we make choices. We make choices, and we have to live with those choices.
And we have to acknowledge each other, because there's a really fine line, and I haven't thought about this in quite some time, but there's a fine line between that philosophical understanding that we kind of are all one, and that we're stronger together, versus like solipsism. I'm the only one that exists, and I'm the only one that matters, and what I want matters, and nothing else matters. Right. And I think we have to be careful there, because and I think maybe that's where there's been a little bit going off track with, yes, you want to be self-aware, you want to be empowered, you want to know you have choices, you want to know, but at the same time, we are part of a network. We can't help that. We share this space.
Yes.
And, going back to my book, where I talk about the human bioenergy field. I mean, it is our personal energy field, but it extends. We affect each other energetically. We can't help that. And so imagine we are all connected. It's like I'm blocking on it.
Indra's net.
The intersecting circles, right?
Indra's net. Yeah. That's one example. But is there like a circular web or something that you're thinking of?
The Vesica Pisces.
Okay.
Yes, the Vesica Pisces. where the two circles intersect together.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Right.
I was
Or
thinking.
Venn diagram, if you will.
Yeah. Okay.
But the original name was Detached Compassion, but it is like what we use as a Venn diagram. I mean, we're all intersecting like that. We all energetically, we are all part of that.
I would also, this is something I wanted to check in with you on because I trust your wisdom, and that is when we use the word energy, I'm a bit of a skeptic in the sense that even everything on the electromagnetic spectrum is something we don't have full direct access to. We only have experiential access to. So this gets into a whole nother, sorry if we're getting too philosophical here, but energy for me is a metaphor, perhaps, for, again, the universality of what might be. I keep nodding up, as a sort of
the mystery.
Yeah, that signify that. But I look at the term energy, and so it's compatible with what you're saying. I'm going to get semantically stubborn here and just say, for me, it is a web of consciousness. It is a web of biopsychism, or whatever you want to call it. And so energy in its own right is that process. So it's the same thing you're saying. I would frame it more in the sense that it is processorial. It is what you and I are doing now with sound, but it is more mind, I guess, stuff, psyche, that is permeable, or it's not permeable. It has that connectivity to it. So in other words, we affect ourselves on a super subtle levels, but then you and I are using a far less subtle level through sight and sound right now to communicate with each other. For me, so I'm just changing the word energy for psyche, but psyche that is distributed in a way that we just have no idea, right? So I could perhaps support that with, I like that guy Bernardo Kastrup, and he talks about he's an idealist. He talks about the oneness of consciousness, and his way of describing the materiality that we seem to be and have is just a third-person perspective of a sort of instinctual consciousness that just is constant. So matter is a repeatable, steady state kind of thing that doesn't change very much, because again, it is just that which is, but not like you and I, where we're animated and we are very ephemeral, self-organizing systems that happen to be composed of that same matter. But his way of reconciling that is to say that matter is essentially it's a third-person perspective of that which is. So we could say that about the universe, and go beyond the universe, like you were saying earlier. Well, what goes beyond that, which is sort of like Gödel's incompleteness thing, whereas you can't define what's on the other side. So just give up, like you said. Let's go back down here. So anyway, just the bioenergy to me represents that transjective or transitional area between hard things that we call physical and the more etheric mind stuff, the psyche, the thing that you and I are using right now to acknowledge each other and communicate and share ideas with each other. I see that as relational, so that's that gray area between physicality and psyche, if that makes any sense.
It does.
It's exactly what you just,
energy,
it's exactly.
Yeah, I think energy, the feeling, the image I had when you said that was, it's what is happening between, yes, it is our voices and, the frequency of sound and all that, but that is that space in between us, between, that is energy, and it's measurable. I mean, we do know that there's something that is measurable, that does affect change. And so it is, although I agree with you, I also think there is a physics to it, that there's some sort of interface that we really don't understand, that we don't know.
Right.
And that I think that at some point we just have to acknowledge that and say, okay, we don't know. And again, I get very practical and say, okay, so what comes next? We'll go for a walk outside and enjoy the birds.
Yeah, right. So to be fair, I would say the same thing to a physicist. I would say your talk about atoms and gluons and quarks and leptons and all these things, and even radiation, because like energy is the capacity to do work. That's like the simplest definition of energy. And there are other definitions of energy, but to me, I would say they're, as Bernardo Castro likes to say all the time, they're useful fictions. They're the best we have right now to define that which we experience.
Exactly. They're just
it's just a useful.
They're the vocabulary.
Yes,
And I
yes,
love words. I love painting with words. I love words. And the thing about words is that they really truly are just symbolic representations that we've created, just like time.
yes, they are. And so I guess perhaps
And so, the words, the definitions, that's I think the best example of that is love.
Yeah.
We truly don't know what love is. I mean, we don't.
Yeah. Talk about
And
abstract.
We try to put all kinds of words to that. I mean, in English, we just have that one little word, love, but there's, I don't want to say infinite, but there's certainly an abundance of different definitions. And it's like you were talking about agape. That's, that's a whole different word for a different kind of love, but that is still love.
Yeah.
So I think that that's also just part of our human condition, that we try to create a common vocabulary so we can understand each other while we're in this limited form.
Yeah. And language, speaking of limited, is deeply limited and it's contingent. You can't define one thing without invoking something else that it goes into infinite regress. So it's circular, it's whatever. And so
that is why I began. That was my first thought about making intuition the cornerstone, because what I realized was intuition was the language, the inner subtle language that gives us information about what is in our personal human bioenergy field. And, Valerie Hunt used to say, well, there's quanta of information, there's packages of information that we are bringing in, that we're holding there. And she didn't talk about past lives, she talked about life hoods. And that's the third part of the book that I go into. And the reason she did that is because when we talk about past life, it's as if it's happened and it's done. And in some sense it has. But if we want to say that there's some energetic imprint that we bring, I don't know how, but let's say that it's there, then it is existing as if it is happening now. And we know because of the emotions that we have associated with it. And so with her, what I learned was our goal is to unblock where the emotions have been blocked. So that energy can flow freely. Energy cannot flow freely and coherently when we're blocked, when we're holding that stuff as if it was right there. And the minute that you've resolved a past issue in this life, because you feel liberated, you don't think about it anymore, it's done.
Yeah, absolutely.
So her idea was, if we have other lives that we bring into this life, then it works exactly the same way. And that's why she coined the term lifehood rather than talking about past lives. I always loved that. I thought, it's like your childhood. You think about your childhood and you think about something that happened and it's like, whoa, that's like, I'm reliving it until that's resolved or you come to some deeper understanding. And then it's like, oh yeah, that happened.
Yeah.
It's part of who I am. It becomes part of the tapestry of who we are. And it may be threads that are a little bit wonky, but they're still there. And they just are part of the beauty that each of us are as individuals.
Yeah, absolutely. And to bring a little more clarity in, I think the reason I would say maybe a synthesis between bioenergy and sort of a etheric, mysterious part of our psyche or mind or whatever you want to call it, is that folks can get dualistic in a sense. They can go Cartesian on us and say, well, they literally think that there is a vibrational pattern or field. And I don't know. I'm not saying that there isn't, but I think, and I've witnessed this, I know people that have said things like, oh, I just shifted my blah, 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 but they were basically just making a choice or a decision about something, but they kind of framed it in the sense that, well, I just changed my energy around, and that's good. That's a functional heuristic, and I get that. But so I would kind of weave a synthesis of like the energy. So to catch something that you had just said, like if there is a pattern stuck, I would just say that's a transpersonal memory, right? And I think that's not controversial in the way you're presenting it, that the transpersonal memory, that from the lifehood prior or prior, is a thorn that needs to be extracted. And so again, I'm looking perhaps for a synthesis here where it's just like the mind and the mind stuff, and whether it's our sense of individual mind or it's the transpersonal mind, that energy, again, going back and forth in synthesis here, is a means of healing, a means of for letting go of a memory. So like if in my personal life, in the 53 years that I've been on this planet, I had something happen at 6 years old, traumatic, stuck with me, I'm expressing either pathologies or some subclinical behavior because of it, and I'm not aware of it. You come along and you work with it. To me, that's kind of the same method of action as what you're describing with the previous lives, the lifehoods, and healing the wound from an experience that's unresolved in another experience. And it's all, to me, again, you just said earlier, what is time, right? So the lifehoods, even to me, is very ambiguous. Like so I'm trying to hold to the idea that if there is a oneness, a universal unitariness to all, everything, whether it's matter or mind, and that's a monism, that the healing story, the healing tools that we employ, not get confused, not extract or separate out into a dual aspect. So in other words, the energy can be confused sometimes by some people to think that, and it doesn't matter because if it happens, it happens. But that's where my caution would be, is to, use energy, but also if it helps the person to say, this is your history, this is an emotional, transpersonal memory or transpersonal emotion or a transpersonal trauma that has been woven into your fabric, whatever that is, energetic, psyche. To me, it's pretty much the same thing. So anyway, I'm really, really digressing here, but I just wanted you to see my point that I'm not trying to separate anything. It's more against semantic in a sense, but also there's a utility in the semantic temporary separation and then, reconciliation with that. So that's all. Is just, I would be cautious for dualism, and I would be cautious for people, especially people trying to do self-help where they think they're working on something, but maybe they're not really digging in. And that's where you're an expert, and that's where you can recognize those things, and shaman and people who do therapy and things like that. So anyway, I'm making a lot out of nothing, but it's more that I just wanted to clarify that we're talking the same thing. It's just that I would synthesize mind stuff also, or the consciousness, into what you're saying with bioenergy and biofield, because I see that as a beautiful heuristic. I mean, what better visual representation can you have than and we see it in iconography in the sainthood and Christ and all these things in Christianity and 13th century triptychs and all this. You have the halo and the presence about ourselves that is etheric or that is not corporeal. So anyway, I'll leave it to you. I'm rambling here.
So my response to what you're saying is that it's kind of like but we talked about going out into the greater universe and then reaching a point and having to come back.
Mm-hmm.
I do believe it's useful to think in terms of duality, because I think there is a process of integration that we have to accept. So that's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I begin to pay attention to reincarnation lifehoods, not because I was interested in who was I in another life. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I would have dreams that I didn't quite understand, or I'd be somewhere that I had feelings I couldn't quite understand.
Mm-hmm.
But I was interested because I began to wonder, how does that affect us in that process of integrating? How does that affect us in that? Because it's like you have to come into the self first, fix all of that, get that all of that coherent, and then we can become that ripple effect out and release it. And one of the reasons that I paid attention to past lives or lifehoods is Valerie Hunt. That was her work that she did, and in order to work with her, you had to do it. And I worked with her for many years. And what I noticed was that the process that we would undergo, there was a realness to it. Now it comes back to what we were saying to intuition. It was just a knowingness and the emotions that came with it. And it was the emotions that got my attention, because I thought, I can daydream and fantasize and make up stories, and I watch movies and books, and you have big emotional responses, but you don't get that intensity of emotion with anything except something that's really real. We'll call it really real, whatever that means, but
Yeah.
An experience that we can define. And that's where I began to pay attention, because I thought, in that case, there's a reason that the memory come up, this image comes up, this discomfort comes up. And what I discovered for myself were some of the things that I felt so drawn to that I just could not release. They were just, when I could go through a whole process, whether it was symbolic or not, but, let's say there's something there. And in the way that I said, unblock the emotions, unblock whatever was stuck in that life. And it's amazing to me in doing this work with others and myself, how it's always much more simpler than what we think it's going to be. It's rarely, oh, I was burned at the stake and that's why, it's rarely that. It's more the same kinds of issues that we deal with in this life. A lot of the things we regret most, or a lot of the things that keep us stuck the most, are not necessarily the burned at the stake moments, but the other decisions that we make.
Right. Oh, yeah. Mundane abuse of someone's trust or violation.
Or passivity.
Yeah.
Passivity is a big one.
Right.
Passivity
and the guilt
is
that comes with it.
Huge one.
Yeah. And the guilt that follows if you have a soul.
Exactly. So that is what got my attention about reincarnation, because otherwise I thought it really, it's kind of fun, but it doesn't serve a purpose. And because my interest is always, how are we evolving? How can we be everything that you're talking about? That unity, divine one. It's like we've got to go first into ourselves, and then we can be that. We got to clean up the mess, and then we can be that.
To live it, to embody it, absolutely. To conceptualize it is a different story, which was kind of what I'm doing.
Well, we can all conceptualize it.
Yeah.
And that's what I was saying. We pay lip service to being divine and doing,
performative divinity.
Very, very few of us, I think, truly do that, because it's not that easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And one way I like to, and of course I'm just outgassing opinions here, but one way I like to reconcile reincarnation and the value of it in my little head here is I invert things and I say, well, what if I am, okay, let's take for granted that it for the sake of this segment here, is that there is nothing but conscious, nothing but and you could call it God, you could call it the oneness, the universe, the universe is, to me, is a little deceptive because the universe is physical, and this, I think, transcends physicality.
Yes.
But anyway, if there is the one, that which is, and I would then put myself in that position of being that which is, and then I have all these little ephemeral pop-ups of you and myself and the other 7.5 billion people on this planet experiencing things. I like the idea, and one of the sort of easy to access terms is the Akashic field, or the records of all that has ever been experienced. I like that. It's a nice story that makes sense, in a sense, if you believe in this greater mind or greater consciousness or God or whatever. Anyway, so that field of memory, of stored experience, which is both just like a regular lifetime, it is trauma, it is bliss, it is all these things. And so the resolution or the reexamination or the settling of trauma or passivity or any of these things can get re-experienced or settled or resolved, right? But I think for me, I take out the middleman, and I take out the fact that I'm going to be me when I die, and I'm going to go not reside somewhere and then get an assignment and come back. For me, I would take myself out of the picture and just say that another being will be born into this world with access that it can't recognize to a set of experiences that happens. And this is where I like the idea where there's a child, I don't remember where he's from, but he's famous because he was born and then he was starting to tell stories of having been a shot down fighter pilot in World War II. And, you know, he saw photos of his squadron, and he's like, there's Joe, there's Mac, there's Bob, and, you know, all these things. So I would acknowledge that as just being the permeability that he had access to that without, you know, it's just an instinctive access or whatever the process is. So for me, that's how I work with the idea of reincarnation, is that I don't know if I've been given an assignment as a being, as Justin, but I am here experiencing, and if this relational process going on between myself and that which is the Akashic field, the field of subjectivity, whatever it is, that I am, by whatever, again, mystery, I don't know, just capable of helping to resolve what you're talking about with life hoods and stuck patterns and things like that. So in other words, it might be iterative. It might be an iterative process. It could be like the fractals, you know, where it's just fractal upon fractal of trauma and joy and bliss and all these things that just would blow our minds if we had access to how it actually really works.
There it is. And there it is.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what my reaction is to some of what you're saying. I love it. I think it's a very sophisticated and probably closer to the truth way of looking at it. However, I'm kind of a whatever works for whoever it is type of person.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you did it in the interview before the interview, and you asked me about why I wrote the book, which is Living Aware and Inspired, by the way. Yeah, thank you.
Get a plug in there.
Because to bring it all kind of full circle, we're all looking for something that we call the truth that unifies us. And we're getting there through different languages, different forms of expressions. When I wrote the book, this was based mostly on my work with Valerie Hunt, because I felt like I needed to define clearer, not just the work I had done with her, but what my process was, to clarify it for myself and hopefully to serve as a model for others. Now, by the time the book was picked up by my publisher, Right Life Publishing, little plug for them, Right Life Publishing.
Small print, you know, woo, woo. Anyway, sorry.
Well, I'm very grateful because she was just wonderful and very insightful, because by that time I had gone past my work with Valerie Hunt and I was doing the Joe Dispenza work. And I thought, how can I put this out there when there's this brilliant voice of Joe Dispenza. And it was she who said to me, your voice is different, but it might reach others.
Mm-hmm. Well,
and so here's what I was going to say about what you said. I think it's brilliant, but how many people can really get that? Yeah. I would have trouble with that.
Yeah.
So I have to work on that. And so where we want to go is where people can enter.
Yeah.
And that's why I use medications.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in bed and can't even get out to, brush your teeth, there's no way you're going to be able to think of the oneness of the universe, know?
Oh, absolutely.
And so let's start there. Yeah. And that's why reincarnation in a more personal sense becomes valuable.
Ownership.
And I've worked with people who did not believe in reincarnation, but they would come in with these experiences. And I said, okay, let's just treat it as a symbolic metaphor, like a dream. Mm-hmm. All right, no problem. It doesn't matter.
Right.
It's whatever gets us to that point.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. So to close a circle on my end, whatever I say, again, you just acknowledged it, is just I said it, I'm outgassing an opinion, but it's food for thought, and it is a way to influence thought. Just like I mean, I listen to so many different lectures and books and yada yada, and it all has an impression on me, and it changes me. I'm fluid, and that's, to me, the first little kernel or seed of wisdom that could possibly be planted in this being. And I'm not wise, but I try to aspire to one day, maybe in my last day on earth, to seek that, and push that. But anyway, what I say is just food for thought. And I agree completely that it is all perspectival. It is all to the sensibilities. We're like fingerprints. We are all very unique in the language we hear. If I was talking to somebody in Malaysia or somewhere else, or maybe north of the Arctic Circle, it would have to be a whole completely different. You and I speak very similar terms and ideas, but I totally acknowledge and accept that. So the kind of skepticism I practice is never to make declarative statements. It's never to pass judgment. It's never to refute. It is only to ask the next question. So that might give insight. Yes. Yeah. So and that's what I'm doing, is I'm just asking the question, but I'm also, presenting a thought. And I completely acknowledge what you say. And if it is a psychotechnology that helps somebody move forward, then yes, let it be about that you were Cleopatra in another lifetime, or Mary Queen of Scots, and that you got into kind of a mess.
Nobody is ever that.
I know. I'm just being.
When you really get people, they never do that. They start out with, I'm this simple person in this simple place living a simple life. You never get not when you're doing the work seriously.
No, I know. I'm just being silly, but
yeah.
If it helps, if it's a heuristic or if it's a tool to help you solve a something, to fix the circuit or solve a problem,
right.
Then absolutely.
And that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the fact that people come back and say, okay, let me just say myself, when I did this work, I was transformed.
Mm-hmm.
I was transformed. And, I can't explain it. And you kind of argued the idea that energetically we're not really like shifting. There is a shift. You feel it, know it. I don't know what it is, whether it's new neural networks being created, whether it's new neural networks affecting the way the energy is expressed, and therefore rearranging that energetic field so that the access of information in the way that you were describing shifts. But something changes, and you know it. It's not like, oh, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. You know it.
Sure, it's felt.
And the people around you know it. And sometimes they like it and sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
I know at one point my husband said, sometimes I miss the old Helen. And I said, oh, you mean that doormat that just would sort of roll over and play dead?
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, good riddance. Yeah, right. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. No, I completely agree with you. And you know what? I mean, we are physical creatures. So what I'm doing is I'm jumping the gun. I'm getting, and as I said before we hit record, I like to talk about the meta perspective, right? And so what could possibly be going on behind what's going on. And dualism is, as you pointed out a moment ago, is necessary. And I can see that 100%. So again, I'm getting beyond layers of abstraction that probably aren't therapeutic or good mechanisms of discovery or et cetera. But you and I are talking, and that's just where I'm just kind of like, because I think if you can do that and you can come back and maybe be more fluid in how you interpret things, because here's, again, I alluded to it earlier. I think people can lead themselves to a type of what I call, so there's dark suffering and there's light suffering for me. And light suffering is to be working with tools and ideas and thoughts and modalities and practices, but never accomplishing the goal. And it leads to a type of suffering. And it's not necessarily that a person's going to go into spiritual bypassing. It is that they are on this maybe a branch line of something that they should be on the main line, and they've branched out onto something. And that's, again, where fluidity in your ability to transit ideas and modalities. So look, going back to the Venn diagram or the Indra's net ideas, that you can transition from things more fluidly. And that's something that I like to work with if I ever get folks that I could ever talk to, is just, be open and, know that, as you pointed out, it's all relative. It's all relative to perspective, background, upbringing, culture, etc. And so in other words, alleviate frustration if you think you've tried everything, you've done everything, and doggone it, you're still, there's something not right. And that's where I think you can have a pressure valve if you just learn this sort of pre modality or pre system to say, as we've been saying, it's perspectival. It is culturally dependent and contingent. It is contingent upon your own nature of your psyche, your own nature of your history, and how you came into the world. So anyway, that's all. That's all. That's
experience.
Yes, exactly.
And I will say this, and this goes back to where we begin our own personal work. I would never do past life work unless somebody requested it, but with somebody who was in the midst of not having figured out how to sort, I don't know how to say this. I worked for years in trauma, years. I was the psychiatrist for our rape crisis and trauma center, child abuse. I saw people with dissociative disorders, severe trauma. I also trained at the VA, so I saw lots of veterans. And so trauma has been a big thing.
Sure.
And I recognize that you cannot go to somebody who has come with trauma and say, well, why would you have chosen that for this life? What are you coming into this life for?
Bam.
To deal with that? Exactly. And same with life, past life. And that's what I tried to say, and maybe I said it clumsily, that there's value in reconciling who we are in this life and how we are, let's say, choosing to live, because we may not be able to change the fact that there was trauma. But we've all known people who were horribly traumatized, and I've known people who were horribly traumatized who really created wonderful lives for themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And this is, a moment ago, you alluded to the dark suffering. And I think that dark suffering is when we don't give others or ourselves the opportunity, the chance to go beyond that past trauma. And that is where I agree with Dr. Dispenza, that it's like living it in the present, and you got to figure out a way to
deprogram. Yeah.
To get, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because the rest of life can be amazing. But sometimes, again, it's the fear of empowerment that keeps people from being able to do it. So it's like building blocks, in my
Yeah.
work. I always think of it, and I'm kind of Socratic in my work too. I
Okay.
ask lots of questions like basically like where are you at? You
Mm-hmm.
know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and to try to help people come to it on their own, in their own way. When I had a different sort of practice, I remember there was a patient, and again, intuitive. She came in, I knew that she had this other big issue. She never spoke of it, never. And I never brought it up. I
Mm.
just kept quiet. It took a year. I got to call them enchilada sessions because she'd come in and talk about like where the best enchiladas are, you know?
Yeah.
And I'd go along with her because there was something happening that was nonverbal that took a year for her to
Mm.
be able to finally say, this is my truth. And then we could get work
Yeah.
going. But it is about honoring the space where people are.
Yeah. Yep.
And, somebody is in that dark suffering and they are not able to or willing to come out of it. All we can do, this goes back to the agape, all we can do is love them unconditionally, love them. And I've had to teach a lot of people, especially lately, about detached compassion.
Mm.
There's a lot of people who say, "Oh, I'm an emotional empath. I feel everybody." And I always go, "Why?
Mm.
Why are you making that choice? Isn't that uncomfortable?" You know? And people don't realize just because you feel the suffering, it's not your suffering.
Right.
And so that idea of detached compassion has to come in. It's letting go,
Yeah.
but letting go lovingly
Yeah.
and
Absolutely.
knowing it's not yours and knowing it's not necessarily yours to fix it.
That's strong medicine for somebody who is doing the work you do, or any kind of, even coaches, people who are doing psychology, is to not inherit. What is that? Countertransference, I think, when you end up inheriting some of the
Well,
patients.
when you're seeing yourself
Yeah.
and unconscious processes that you start responding more from your issues, and that's why, as a therapist, I do think it's important to have incredible self-awareness and be awfully careful. And I always, if I'm going to self-reveal to somebody that I'm working with, I always stop. A self-reveal meaning telling about myself.
Mm-hmm.
I always ask myself, is this going to be helpful? Is this therapeutic? Who is it serving? Does it serve me or does it serve the person?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there's times where the rule when I was being trained was you never reveal about yourself.
Mm.
And what I came to see was particularly women, there's a lot of women who did not have good role mothers,
Mm-hmm.
role models uh, for for a loving, compassionate woman who had their back. And I found myself self-revealing more in those situations. And it always served as a model. This is how
Mm-hmm.
you do it. Because now they had children and they didn't know how to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've always looked at medicine as being a matriarchal archetype. There's plenty of men in medicine, but to me, the healing, the nurturing, the recovery, and nurturing especially, and seeing
The,
somebody through
the
that,
art,
the
the
art of
art
that
of medicine.
is
And that's a
is
lot of what's being lost in medicine. It's all,
nuts and bolts.
if we're only looking at numbers. And, I was thinking a moment ago, I forgot what it was you said, but how we're all unique with our own thumbprint. And I have been I want to say a bad traditional psychiatrist because I rebelled against the idea of diagnoses.
Mm, mm,
And I trained with some of the people who created the DSM,
yeah.
the standard. And I remember one of my professor saying, well, we came up with the DSM-3 or whatever it was because we were sitting around talking and saying how successful DSM-2 was, and we had to kind of like keep going.
Right,
And I
right.
went, what? He says, well,
Yeah.
we were up till like, 4 a.m. and we came up with this. And it's like, oh, okay. And I have never learned the code, never in all my
Uh,
years of practice. It's sort
oh
of
my
like my
gosh.
own, passive aggressive, like, no, it's hard for me to see a person and then just kind of cubby hole them and say, okay, you fit all this criteria, so therefore
Yeah.
you are that.
Pigeonhole you right in there. Yeah. You would appreciate an interview I did a few months ago, not the interview itself, but the individual that I interviewed. And she's a professor at UT San Antonio. In fact, you could actually go out and have tea with her sometime. I think she's on sabbatical at Pitt right now, doing some kind of work. But anyway, she's stationed where you are, and she teaches philosophy of science, and one of her projects has been to have patient inclusion in the DSM-5 revisions, or possibly a DSM-6 if that comes out. I think the DSM-5 came out in 2014. And so it's probably it seems to be like every 16, 18 years they do a new one. Anywho, she's advocating for patient inclusion by way of anecdote. So if, 500 schizophrenics are reporting, particular types of schizophrenics are reporting statistically stable and coherent data, then we need to talk about that and not have the lords of the DSM, like you're saying, they just pigeonhole things and quantify things in a particular way, algorithmically or impersonally or whatever. So she's doing great work in trying to get, I don't think it's democratization necessarily, but it is inclusiveness that is vital, in my opinion. If again, you can in doing the accumulation of anecdotes that you qualify for certain things, you can weed out certain things, and so that all has to be taken into account. But I love that idea that it's becoming more accessible in a
Yes.
sense, and that will steer a future generations of therapists to, not like you're saying, not necessarily have to work with widgets and data points and things like that
Right.
that don't necessarily reflect our nature.
And what you're talking about is listening to
Yeah.
people. And
Yeah.
I'll share a little anecdote along these lines, and also my little rebelliousness. In my training, I did a consultation. It's called psychiatric consultation rotation, and you have to go to wherever you're called. And I was called to a medical unit because this man was hallucinating, and they were sure he must be schizophrenic or having a psychotic episode. And I sat down and listened to him. And he was talking about the voices he was hearing. And I said, well, tell me what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And everything they were saying was benevolent and loving and supportive. And I thought to myself, this is not schizophrenia. And if it is, let's not mess with it. You know what?
Yeah. Yeah.
I ended up telling him, I don't think there's a problem, but don't tell any other doctors about this anymore.
Yeah, keep it our secret.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so beautiful, because the last lady that I just interviewed is she's at Lancashire, and she's a research fellow there, but she works with children, and she works with children who may be labeled as being psychotic or schizophrenic rather, and because they're doing what you just said, but it's not negative or dark voices, because some classic schizophrenia, it's kind of self-destructive chatter and stuff like that, but she's getting children who are having more if we want to say light side, like you were just saying, more pleasant things and benevolent things, and so she's researching that and trying to soften that a little bit so that they don't just get slammed into some kind of diagnosis, right? And that could just destroy them. They put them on antipsychotics or something, and they're 13 years old, and watch out.
No.
And
that's why I'm very comfortable. That's why I'm very comfortable with the idea that maybe what we call schizophrenia is really a brain thing. It's a material, physical thing. But the other is a connection to that quantum that we don't understand. And especially in children. And yes, I actually did a fellowship in child psychiatry where I trained with a lot of kids and, had experienced personal experiences with a child that was highly intuitive, very similar to the one who recognized his, the people. And so one of the things that I did in the past is talk about intuition in children and allow that, pay attention. Again, it's about listening. And it comes back to that same hub, which is listening to each other, being compassionate with each other, understanding each other, taking time. And that's why you were calling medicine that matriarchal, because to me, medicine has to be both. Just as I had to reconcile the intuitive and the scientist, the left brain and the right brain, the anima and the animus, I think we are all called to do that.
Yeah.
And medicine is at its best when we do that, when we retain the art of listening. And again, in this rotation, what I learned was, rather than come in with my pad, how are you, how you doing, if I pulled up a chair and sat down, even for 5 minutes, it became a more meaningful interaction, even if the time was the same. The message, just the message, I'm here, I'm listening, I'm paying attention. And people often say that I'm not much like a doctor, because I'm very respectful to whoever you are, and I'm grateful. I've learned to express gratitude, whether you're here to fix my plumbing or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's a practice that I think we all have to get into more of. We're not spending more time. We're just getting quiet within ourselves and listening, being present with the other.
Yeah. And I don't know if this would accentuate what you just said, but my naive interpretation of healing, short of physical intervention and splitting somebody open and taking things in and putting things in or taking things out, is it's consensual. It is a permission. And it can be permission from authority, like in your position, you are an authority, but it could also be permission from compassion. And that permission that the person who is seeking the transformation or the transcendence might be the one thing they need. And as you just said, it has to be framed properly, and the language has to flow, I think, properly for that to be at its optimum for that breakthrough. But that's how I tend to look at it, is it is a consensual, permissive, permission-oriented process, that the exchange goes on, and then that it's kind of like self-healing in spontaneous healing events physically. But to me, like, I think I'm focusing more on maybe mental issues and things like that, that it's just a permission to explore, to be brave, to dig deep in the past, and then predict it, look at a future that might be different, and that kind of thing. So again, maybe I'm overstating the obvious, and I don't know, but that's just how I like to look at healings, as they are tete-a-tetes. They are these conversations, like you're saying.
I tend to agree.
Yeah.
Healing, I believe, may be at its best when we are present for someone.
And that's the agape that you were talking, or the nurturing.
Exactly.
So, yeah. Now, I'd like to digress for 1 second before I completely lose my thought. When you were talking moments ago about reincarnation and how we could frame it or whatever, and that when you said something, it got a thought into my head, and I'm like, I would go into a past life regression session in a hot minute with the right person, because it dawned on me, it's like hypnotherapy, but extra liminal. Like, it goes like, so the first layer is this lifetime, everything I've experienced in my years of being. But then it could be extra liminal, where you pass through another gate of obfuscation or whatever, veils or whatever, to resolve that. So I thought of that for myself. I'm going to keep that, because it's beautiful, because it is like a hypnotherapy session to do a past life regression on somebody. And I did one 30 years ago, and it was pleasant. I enjoyed it. I don't know what happened.
I need to say something about that.
Okay.
because you're using two terms that I try not to.
Oh, okay, good.
And
Steer
I
me.
describe I describe the process. Um, I think I finally named it lifehood memory recovery, whatever you want to call it.
Uh-huh.
Valerie called them life shocks. I mean, whatever. But I describe the process in the book. It's the third part of the book. And I have never thought of this as regression.
Mm,
And I don't know that I've sorted out why the regression just sounds like a going backwards.
mhm,
Whereas I'd like to maintain the intention that we are looking at something that is kind of like alive now. It's not
mhm,
going backwards.
mhm.
That gives it a different meaning and a different energy, if you will,
Oh, yeah.
in process of working through it.
Yeah.
The other thing about hypnosis, and maybe I am the most misguided person on hypnosis, but there's a detachment there. Like I'm not really owning this.
Mhm,
And so I never say it's a hypnotic process because I want the person to be present, very
mhm,
present,
mhm.
even if they are in a quote altered state, in order to be able to hear the intuitive information, whatever is coming in.
Mhm. As
And
a,
in the process that we do, it's not regression necessarily, but more a overview. It's
mhm,
looking at a life in its entirety to make sense of it, just like we would in this life. You
mhm,
know,
mhm,
these were my parents, this was my environment, this was my conditions, this was my consciousness, this was how, and to see that as, sometimes a name will come in. Okay, so now it is that sort of separate person. But the ending part of the process is always the recognition
mhm.
that it is the personality of that life and the personality of this life.
Right, right.
And that there is I guess, synergy. There is a oneness about that.
Mhm.
Even though we may spend 3 hours or whatever really looking at a life as if it were a totally separate life.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's why you won't see either one of those words. In fact, I may have even addressed the issue of hypnosis in the book, because I want to be very careful in how we use words to describe the process, to make sure that the intention that we're putting out there is very clear
Mhm,
in
mhm.
engaging in the process. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does, because I did that earlier with the sort of dichotomy, the parent dichotomy of mind and energy. But just to clarify things and then go back to a synthesis again. So, but it's a different creature what we're talking about right now. But again, I was just trying to sort of reconcile something. But so I showed my age, or my sort of going back 30 years to the last time, and so that person who did that was in their 60s, and so this is a lineage thing. It's an artifact of another, like mid 20 or early to mid
No,
20th
people
century link.
mostly
I know. I'm
mostly
just I'm
talk
just
about
citing why
hypno.
I use
Yeah,
those words.
yeah.
And again, it comes into what so a 70-year-old would say past life regression, because for 40 or 50 years that's sort of been the normative. And I totally agree with you. There's better ways to say it, because regression does, but it also has a value in the sense there's a linearity perceived, even though it's there. You and I would probably agree that there is no linearity to it, but we would see it like if I was born in, I was born in 1969. And so if another me was, or, another aspect of meanness was born in 1887, then, that we would want to put that on that linear time scale. But then again, we could argue about the relative nature of time, et cetera. So I think it does have a value, but I agree with you. It could be updated and it could be done, more carefully. And then going to hypnosis, I would say that that's just another consensual permission thing. And I agree with you that it is sort of a dissociative mechanism. But if it is the permission that is necessary for a person to feel as though they're in induction and have a competent man, woman, or person saying things to them, that is the permission, that is the safe space, or whatever you want to call it, for them to then explore what mother might have done, and at age 7, or whatever's going on. And
Yes.
so anyway, but
ultimately
I agree the
does
language could be updated. And
ultimately there has to be ownership of the consciousness of the experience.
Absolutely.
So I don't disagree that it is hypnosis, basically.
Right.
I just don't use that term because of the implication.
I like light induction myself. Like if I'm going to
or just getting into state, or the way Valerie would say it, and it works for me, is opening the field, just opening up to what's out there. In there. wherever the there is, or in
the there that isn't point, you can't point to there. but yeah, it's shutting down the executive functions and getting the planning, organizing, predicting, modeling person out of the way. I always love the committee of me. I always say
you leave your brain at the door. That's what I tell people.
Because it just gets in the way. It's a pain in the ass.
We don't want the brain in this. Well, because otherwise half the time, and I did this too, is we're sitting there going, this can't be real, I'm making this up. Well, this is just coming from nowhere. Because that's what we do.
Oh yeah. and there's some value in that in other contexts of being a person, but not when you're trying to work through some of this stuff. So, believe it or not, we've been an hour and a half in, and it doesn't even seem like it. Isn't that funny? I want to ask you one more question, and then you're always welcome to come back, and you're always going to be there's going to be an open door for you. But and part of my reason for maybe drawing a line is I have to be somewhere at 1 o'clock on my end. So what I would like to do though is ask you, if you were to write another book right now, what do you think you would what do you think you'd want to write about? Or maybe you've already thought of this, and if you don't want to share, if it's too soon.
I actually did, and now it's slipping my mind.
Okay.
We have all these creative ideas while we're driving or whatever, and then we forget to write them down, and then but I think it would be about what we've been talking about. Well, I have two things. One would be, I think many of us want to write our personal story. I wrote some in the book, but I tried to keep it to things that were relevant to what would be coming in the book. So it's not the whole story.
Okay.
But more, a couple of things. One is, well, this would take too long, but how to, what I call get into neutral, and recognize that many of our emotions, it's too many people have written on this for me to write about it, but in my framework, I called it getting into neutral. It's where I had very intense emotions for somebody, and then recognize that those emotions were only hurting myself. That person never even knew. And for me, it was like I literally shifted into neutral, and there was neither, I was fine with that person and I was okay. It didn't matter. And I loved that feeling. It was a good feeling.
Yeah.
But I think it would be, if I really had something to say now, and I always felt I would never write unless I had something to say, it would be about unconditional love. It would be about learning detached compassion as a pathway to unconditional love.
The world could use that right now. I think.
Yeah. Well, because before we get to that comes to what the world is really needing, which is what I was saying a little while ago. Let's all take a deep breath. Let's listen. Let's pay attention. Let's be kinder with one another. Instead of going after each other for all our belief systems, none of which are true, because whatever separates us cannot be true. Only that which we all feel is, the one thing that all religions talk about is love, and loving your neighbor, and loving each other. That's it. Everything else can't possibly be true because it separates us.
Right.
or every religion would have it. So it's not possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think then we would pay attention and realize that we're not paying attention to the things that are important. I mean, I'm concerned about our planet.
Mm-hmm.
This
Mm-hmm.
has been the most amazing gift, the most amazing, beautiful, exquisite thing we have.
Mm-hmm.
And the short-sightedness and the greediness and all the things that are going on to keep us past, all of that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
To get to detached compassion, to get to unconditional love.
Mm-hmm. That's a hell of a
So
book.
if they're, well,
That's a
I
hell of a
don't know
book.
that I have all the words for that. And being a horrible marketer, my publisher may not be thrilled with me.
Oh
And
no!
by the way, here it is, Living Aware and Inspired.
Right. Get your copy now.
Available on Amazon as a ebook and audiobook, also on Barnes and Nobles, on Kobo's, on through
I'll have links down in the description field.
IPG.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll have links in the
And
description field.
I have to say this, or my publisher will never forgive me. If you choose to read this book, please leave a review.
There you go. There you go. Yeah, and having read the book, I think for the audience, I think it's a good heuristic in a sense that it offers perspectives, as we've been talking about in this conversation, on how to get to know yourself, how to cultivate self-awareness, how to understand intuition, which I think is essential, because if we sort of blot that part of ourselves out, that we can bump into things a lot harder and faster, if that makes any sense. And so this is a good book for whether you've been doing self-help and transformative work for a long time,
it's
or
just one more language.
it's
just
another
one more language to say what we all are saying.
Yeah,
it's just a different perspective.
Yep.
And for beginners, I think it's might be particularly helpful.
Yeah.
The science is very, very soft. As a physicist I know, who I asked to write something for the book, told me he could not because the science is way too soft. But that's
good.
okay.
It's a gateway.
It's a gateway. It's a framework to start with. So all made simple.
Yeah, absolutely. Helen, it's been a beautiful conversation. You got me thinking.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you to the audience. All those of you, I look at the analytics and I usually keep about 10%. So there'll be about 30 people still here. So thank you guys very much. Always appreciate your presence.
Thank you. Thank you for your presence. Yes, I didn't realize you had live audience. So
no, it's not live now, but I'm just saying this to the, into the recording for the future, for whoever happens to. So we retain about 8 to 10% of so we start out with like 80 or 100 people that, we might have 10 or 15 people at the end, which is fine, because if you touch, like you said earlier, if you can have that sphere of that presence of influence, that's all that matters. And so if one life is touched by this conversation, wow, that's perfect for me.
I'm very grateful for that. And
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Justin, and to all of you who are paying attention. I hope you did get something that will be meaningful for your life, because it doesn't matter how it comes in, whether it's through a podcast or a book or just walking out to see the trees. Allow it in and live it, and then you'll be living aware and inspired.
Good tie-in. Amen. one more cover shot. Again, all information to access.
Thank you.
Yeah, access Dr. Pankowsky's work will be down in the description field, guys. So thank you so much.
And always with humor. Let's remember that.
Yeah, that's right next to love, man. You got to have humor.
Absolutely.
To get through. Anyway. All right. Well, Justin. Helen, I'll say goodbye to you after we're done recording, and to the YouTube audience, thank you again, and appreciate your support. Take care.
Thank you.